Good morning.
Good morning.
The blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Thank you. Intertestamental period of history. Maybe the last lesson, maybe the next to the last lesson. Let's see what we can get through this morning in our class. This would be lesson number 27. Just a little over a half a year studying this. And we've been through all of this down to, we finished up the Dead Sea Scrolls last week, talking about the Works of Josephus, because that is so important for understanding the time period, intertestamental period, and coming into the time period of the New Testament. So very quickly, the Works of Josephus. Flavius Josephus lived, lived about AD 37, born, and then died about 100. So lived about 63 years. His full name was Yosef ben Mattayahu. That would be the Hebrew understanding of it. He was born of an aristocratic priestly family in Jerusalem. And what have we learned? If it was aristocratic and it was priestly, it was probably Sadducean party, right? Mixing in with the Greeks. At age 16 to 19, he lived with a Jewish ascetic by the name of Banus out in the wilderness. And somebody like that, we typically put that in the realm of the Essenes. And we talked about them in our past studies, that John the Immerser may have been an Essene, raised by the Essenes after his parents died. So he lives out there for 3 years, comes back. When he comes back, he joins the Pharisee party. So evidently he goes from being a Sadducee, going out, studying with the Essenes. When he comes back, he joins the Pharisees, which are a stricter party. They are intensely religious and adhere to a strict observance of the Torah, the law of Moses. Politically, the Pharisees were positioned in the middle of the spectrum. The Herodians and Sadducees aligned with the Greek culture and Roman authority. They were all right with it. They actually promoted it. The Zealots were intense Jewish nationalists in constant rebellion against the Roman rule. They were the opposite side of the spectrum. They carried swords and they would kill every Roman soldier, Roman official, Roman collaborator that they could. That was how they dealt with things. The Pharisees, though, accepted Roman rule as long as the Jews remained religiously independent. In essence, they separated state and religion. As long as you allow us to practice our religion freely, you can control the nation. And isn't that typically what we see going on in the New Testament? And what does Jesus say? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, render unto God that which is God. So at points he takes that type of a position, even though he would want the people to be free politically. But was Jesus a Pharisee? No. Was he a Sadducee? No. Was he an Essene? No. He was somebody who followed God. So in AD 64, Josephus was sent to Rome to negotiate the release of Jewish priests being held prisoner. The Romans in that area, something had happened. Okay, what happened in AD 64 started the Jewish war against Rome. And a lot of the priests were rounded up and they were taken prisoner. Why? Because they're the ones who had power over the people, supposedly. So if the people are revolting, hey, we'll take the priests, we'll arrest them, and they're going to be imprisoned. So he goes to Rome, negotiates the release of these Jewish priests. He's successful in his mission, but while he's there, he's impressed with Rome's culture and sophistication. Hey, that sounds a lot like Herod, doesn't it, who actually grew up in Rome. He is especially overwhelmed by Rome's military might. He looks at that and he says, who could fight against them? Okay, any questions on that? So you understand, at 64, AD 64, he's about, what, 27 years old at that time? But being an aristocrat, he could be in a position where he could go and negotiate this in Rome. So, looking at his military career, which is important, he returns to Jerusalem just prior to that general revolt against Roman rule, which really gets rolling about 66, AD 66. And then the zealots convince the populace to oust the Roman procurator, the man who's in charge, and establish a Jewish government in Jerusalem. In other words, they stepped up this battle against Rome. The priestly class council compromised. Yeah, they've just been released from prison. Hey, let's compromise. Let's keep this tamped down. But they're reluctantly drawn into the rebellion. So Josephus was appointed the Jewish military commander of Galilee. Remember how we talked about how the area of Palestine was split up into 5 districts at one time, and Galilee was one of them. And even at the time of Jesus, how it was a tetrarch, and Galilee was one of these tetrarchs. Well, he's the military commander, ruler, leader. He's set up there to lead the forces in that area. If his own testimony is trustworthy, now we'll discuss more about that later, he desired to make peace with the Romans. He wanted to make peace. He wanted to do what? Compromise. But the local partisans forced him to take a rebellious stance. And though he thought fighting the Romans was futile, he fortified many towns in the north in that Galilee region against the forthcoming Roman attacks. So he didn't want to fight. He was appointed to this position. He wanted to compromise. But the people under him, we're going to fight. You better lead us. He's wishy-washy, isn't he? So he does what the people under him force him to do. The Roman general Vespasian, we'll deal with Vespasian a lot more, well, a little bit more, when we get into the book of Revelation. He arrived in Galilee in the spring of AD 67 and quickly broke the Jewish resistance in the north. It's just an overwhelming flood comes against them. Josephus held the force of Jotapata, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, for 47 days before fleeing with 40 diehards to a nearby cave. He escapes. Against Josephus' urging, the group voted to commit suicide rather than surrender. Oh, that's pretty brave, isn't it? We're not going to surrender. We will commit suicide. Well, he argued that suicide was immoral. So what Josephus proposed was, we'll cast lots, And each of us, each man, will kill another man. That way, we're not committing suicide. So it'd be like, okay, we'll cast lots, and whoever gets the lot, say I get the first lot, I'll kill Lance. Okay, the next guy, Danny gets the lot, he kills me. And it just goes on and on until there's only one person left, see? And then only one person commits suicide, and that's immoral. That's the guy who'll go to hell, you know, whatever.
He takes the money and runs.
Well, just wait. Josephus arranged to draw the last lot, then convinced his intended victim, the guy he's supposed to kill last, to surrender to the Romans. When brought before Vespasian, Josephus claimed to be a prophet and prophesied that Vespasian would soon be emperor. This saved his life. For the next 2 years, he remained a prisoner in the Roman camp. Late in AD 69, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by his troops. And again, we'll talk about this when we study the book of Revelation, because Nero dies. There are 3 very quick emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, I believe are their names, in a year and a half. And they're gone, and Vespasian then becomes the emperor. And when he becomes emperor, he leaves Judea, and Titus, his son, becomes the Roman general, the man who's going to eventually destroy Jerusalem. Later on, he will also become emperor. So, he becomes emperor. Josephus' prophecy had come true. Josephus was given his freedom. How fortunate for him. Doesn't that sound a lot like what Herod had done earlier as we studied about Herod's life? How he made deals and kind of worked his way out of problems. Josephus then fully worked for the Roman cause. He adopted the name Flavius, Flavius Josephus. So why would he do that? Well, that was Vespasian's surname. See, all the emperors before were Caesars. The Julio, and that's pronounced in good English, Julio Caesarians, and now you have the Flavian dynasty of the Caesars coming into prominence. So he adopts the name Flavius Josephus. He later joined the Roman forces under Titus at the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. He was there to help the Romans, not the Jews. He attempted to mediate between the Romans and the rebels, but he was hated by the Jews for his apostasy, and he was distrusted by the Romans because he was a Jew, so he failed to prevent the slaughter in AD 70, which accounts of it were just terrible. So following the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, Josephus took up residence in Rome, where he devoted the remainder of his life to literary pursuits under imperial patronage. In other words, Vespasian gave him money to write books. Do you suppose those books were favorable to Rome and Vespasian? Probably. And that's why we say you've got to be careful with Josephus' works, that they might be a little bit biased toward Rome. Okay, any questions on this? Understanding where he is, okay? Josephus as a historian, some of his literary works, right? His first work was Bellum Judaicum, which was a history of the Jewish war. And it was written in 7 books between AD 75 and 79. So he starts writing about 5 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Understand, the war is still going on. Jerusalem's destroyed. A lot of the Jews, along with Christians, remember, Christians ran. They escaped the destruction of Jerusalem. Some of the Jews who were in the fight against Rome also escaped. They ran to the hills, but they conducted guerrilla warfare against Rome up to, and I believe it was about AD 135 before they were eventually totally put down. But he's writing this history about the Jewish wars, and it takes him 4 years to write some of these books, and it's toward the end of Vespasian's reign. He summarizes Jewish history from mid-2nd century BC, that would be 150 BC, up to the start of the Jewish wars, the beginning of it. He then gives a detailed account of the Great Revolt of AD 66 through 70. He stressed the invincibility of the Roman legions. Look how powerful they are. Who can stand against them? They got great generals, don't they? Vespasian and where's he going to slant it? Who's he writing it for? Who's his audience primarily? It's the Romans, right? So this may have been to convince the diasporian Jews, and when I say diaspora, okay? Those are the Jews who are spread out through the Roman Empire. Peter, in his writings, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, talks about Christians who are spread out with them also. That's the diaspora, right? But what he's also doing as he's writing these, maybe trying to convince the Jews there, don't fight against the Roman Empire. They're too powerful. They're too strong. Look what they did to Jerusalem. You can't survive it. Give up. Just continue to be a licit religion and bow down to the Roman secular authorities. But if they were contemplating a revolt, then, hey, resistance to Roman arms would be futile. In these works, he is extremely hostile to Jewish patriots and callous to their faith. If these stupid people hadn't tried to fight the Romans, they might still have their nation and their temple. Does that make sense? That's basically what he's saying. They're idiots for fighting Rome. What's the problem? I say problem with that. What was their thinking? We get more into that in the book of Revelation. What was the Jews thinking in going to war against Rome? You had all that diverse thought going on there, the different parties. What was their thought? Could it be that the Jews were finally convinced Messiah is coming and now's our opportunity? You see what I'm saying? They missed it. Now they're looking at a political aspect of Messiah. Now's our time to fight. This is the time. This is the time period. This is what Daniel was talking about. They're convinced it's time to fight. Problem is, they missed the right time and now God's against them. We'll hit more of that in the book of Revelation. Danny, it looked like you had a question or a comment.
Well, what I'm sitting here thinking is, you know, up until back in, I believe it's Peter's writings and others in our previous studies, the Jews were left alone by Rome and were allowed to pretty much take care of all the business of the western, eastern Mediterranean area, Judea and all that, as long as they didn't rock the boat. Rome just stayed away, and you know, they had a governor there, but he was just caught up mostly in the material part of royalty or governing, whatever, however you want to call it. And now they've turned the whole situation upside down. The whole situation's turned upside down by Christ.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And not only did they miss that, they forgot about how good they had it under Roman rule, and now they're revolting, just trying to put the whole thing together as to the pieces that they failed themselves miserably.
Because that's the next, because they failed God, they failed the Christ. Yes. And we'll get into this as we really get into the finer points of the introduction material of Revelation, the way I want to present it. Christ comes, he's crucified, the day of he's resurrected, the day of Pentecost comes, he establishes his kingdom, and then the message goes out into all the world and even goes to Rome. There's a new kingdom and there's a new king. What did Herod do when the Magi came to him and said, where's the one born king of the Jews? We've come to worship him.
Dead.
He started killing babies who were in the lineage of David. What do you think the Roman Emperor Nero is going to do when the gospel comes to Rome and Paul is preaching and there are people in Nero's household who are speaking, who are believers and are speaking about Christ being king? What's Nero's reaction going to be? I'll go down there and I will exterminate anybody who's expecting to be a king. What does he know about Judaism? What does he know about the lineages, the tribes? He starts persecuting Christians. That's fine with the Jews, right? Guess what? The Jews aren't going to escape it. And that's why all these troubles develop. And Nero is the first great persecutor of not only the church, he's a persecutor of Jews. Even though it was a legal religion, but he's going to go after anybody who is supposedly going to be a new king. Because, hey, how do you get to be the emperor of Rome?
Get rid of all your competition.
That's right. Okay, but that's heading into, that's more in our, going to be in our study, and looking at Revelation and why that book becomes so important. So, the history of the Jewish war is the prime source for the Jewish revolt and valuable for its description of Roman military tactics and strategy for that time. But remember that it's going to be biased toward the Romans. So when you come to parts in it where it says, well, there were roving bands of Jewish soldiers who come in and kill people in Jerusalem and stack the bodies in the temple and did all this and defiled the temple. Most historians say, no, it was the Roman soldiers who did that. But who wants the Roman soldiers blamed? Not the Romans, right? Well, but you can see why, if Josephus is biased for Rome, he's going to make it, well, it was Jewish soldiers who did that. They did it to themselves. All right. Josephus' greatest work is the Antiquities of the Jews, and he wrote this about AD 93. The Jewish Wars was earlier, now it's 93. He's a very old man for those times. It consists of 20 books tracing the history of the Jews from creation to the revolt of AD 66-70. So he's going to go clear back to creation, come through, here's the history of the Jews, and he's going to pick up some more of that 150 BC up to the Jewish wars. And what he's doing, it's an attempt to present Judaism in a favorable light, bless you, a favorable light to the Hellenistic world. Now he wants to make an apology, so to speak. Yeah, I was treasonous to my religion and treasonous to my country, but now I want to show you why the Jews were really not such bad people. But in this book, or series of books, it virtually ignores the prophets. It embellishes biblical narratives. In other words, it adds to some of the stories. It stresses the rationality of Judaic laws and institutions. Rationality, okay? Judaism is stripped of its fanaticism, when it's stripped of its fanaticism, is made appealing to the cultivated and reasonable man. You've all heard of Jefferson's Bible, right? What was Jefferson's Bible? Take out the miracles and just leave in it. Like the book of Proverbs, book of Ecclesiastes, this and that, take out the teachings of Jesus, but apart from the miracles and apart from the resurrection, just the rational aspects. So Jesus was a good man, but he wasn't really God. Stuff like that. You understand what I'm saying? The rationality. So, historically, scholars say his coverage is erratic. Nevertheless, sources are presented that otherwise would have been lost. He uses sources that probably from the Talmud and from other Jewish books. And historians at that time, there were other secular historians that were writing that we just don't have the books. And doesn't Luke say basically the same thing? When he begins the gospel according to Luke, he says, many have, written down, and I'm paraphrasing it, many have authored books about the life of Christ, but I want to make sure that what we have said, is true and delivered to you, Theophilus, lover of God, that you know that it's true. So here he is, so many years later, he's probably getting close to a time when he's going to die, and think maybe his conscience is bothering him a little bit. But still, he doesn't want to go all the way and say that he is a believer in God and, you know, the miraculous aspects of the Old Testament. The Antiquities, that's that big book, contains two famous references to Jesus Christ. The one in book 20 calls him the so-called Christ. Because remember, he's Jewish, or was raised Jewish, but he still has kind of a dislike for Christianity. Christianity has spread, but he doesn't like it. And a lot of the reason maybe he doesn't like it is because Christianity has spread. The concept of the Christ has been accepted by so many, and that has led to the downfall of his nation, or of the Jews, and what he grew up in, the culture he grew up in. The Testimonium Flavianum. Testimonium Flavianum. In book 18 has been a subject of intense scholarly debate. What is that? Well, Antiquities 18:3-3. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, right? Not the Son of God. But he says, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, Messiah. What does that mean to him? What does that mean to the majority of the Jews at that time? Does that mean Word who became flesh, or does that mean a leader? It would be more a leader like David. Okay? He was the Christ, and when Pilate, with the suggestion of the principal men against us, had condemned him to the cross, those who loved him at first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians. Notice that tribe of Christians, along with the 12 tribes of Israel, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. And this is in 97, so what happened to the other 12 tribes? They exist in heritage, so to speak, but not in any formal manner.
So if he doesn't believe that part where he says he appeared to them alive again, he's just saying what others have said, but he doesn't truly believe that happened.
He's saying what other people have said. It's like the news reporter. Here's what people are saying. So, many scholars believe that the references to Jesus' divinity and messianic status were likely added by later Christian copyists. They said, it wasn't even him saying it. Some Christian somewhere was making a copy of Josephus' works, this book, and put this in there. The reasoning is that these elements do not align with Josephus' Jewish beliefs and his context as a historian working under Roman rule. You see, it doesn't make sense. That's why when things occur like this, scholars look at it. Now, what do we say? Hey, we just don't know. Right? So, could a Christian have done that later? Yes. Could Josephus have done this, saying, well, this is what people of our time are saying. You got to make up your own mind, right? But be careful. There are people who will say, see, Josephus mentions Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ, and doing miracles and stuff like that. Be careful. Got to be careful. And just the very fact that there was someone like Jesus is historically important. We should get our information from the Bible. I've only got 2 more slides, so we want to get through this. We're going to get through it today. 2 other books that he wrote. Vita, which means life, was appended to the Antiquities as a defense against the charges leveled against him in the late AD 66 revolt. Okay? The AD 66 revolt. What happens? All right, the Jews hate him because what? He went over to the Romans. The Romans don't like him because he's a Jew, so he's got to give reasons for what he did, and it's basically, who was it? There's a guy, I think is he a senator now? This?
I don't know.
I forget. McCormick, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania today. I believe it was him. It may have been the other guy. There was somebody running for office in Pennsylvania that was running against somebody, and I forget whether it was in the primary or in the general election, that lost. McCormick, the one lost. But the other guy, for some reason, there was something he had done that he was actually helping an enemy somewhere along the line. And the voters still voted him. But it's like, hey, what? I guess, too close to the election. Okay. But here he is. He's got to give a defense. All these people are blaming you for these things, you know. Why is this happening? Well, he's going to give a defense. Against Appian, serves as a defense of Judaism against the criticisms of Appian, a Hellenistic scholar who wrote disparagingly about Jewish history and culture. Okay? It would be like somebody today who will take stuff that was written about Jews at the time of Hitler. And terrible things were said about Jewish people then. And, well, here's why that's wrong. Because what's he doing in the later years? He's saying, here's why the Jewish people are misunderstood. Here's what they've done in history. And we talked about it before, the alphabet that we have, a lot of the learning. Listen, their close relationship to God for several years, I think, promoted a lot of good understanding and reasoning skills that were lost, but were applied over to other generations, other groups of people, like the Greeks and like the Romans. Look what Daniel did in Babylon, and then in Persia, the effect that was on them. So, yeah, you can make up all kinds of stuff against people that you hate. So he's giving a defense of that, of their history and their culture, because they didn't fall in line with everybody else. The ones who continued in Yahweh worship. that were faithful. Did some of them fall in with everybody else? Yeah, that's what we studied in the minor prophets, wasn't it? And that's what led to their destruction. And finally, how trustworthy are the works of Josephus? His deeds a measured man. Right? What did he do? Josephus' actions during the war and his defection to the Romans show a strong instinct for survival and pragmatism. He's a survivor. He's a pragmatist. He did what he needed to do. What did the Jews think about him? He's a traitor and a coward. His defection made him a contentious figure among the Jews who saw him as a traitor, and I would suggest also a coward. Yet his writings are invaluable for understanding the historical context of AD first century. There it is. So if you want to read it, I got a book. It's that thick. It's a big book. It's full of his writings. And it's in English. I mean, but you got to wade through it, understanding who he is and what's going on in that first century. Guess what's next?
Well, his importance is revealed just by his mention in the Scripture.
Josephus is not mentioned in Scripture. Well, you might be thinking of Joseph, the father, but Josephus, there were lots of people named Josephus. But this Josephus is not mentioned in Scripture. And going back to something that you'd mentioned either, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, about when we talked about the diaspora, okay? Remember, 1st, 2nd Peter, my understanding, those books were written before AD 70, before the destruction of Jerusalem. I believe the book of Revelation was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, at the time of Nero. A lot of people say, no, it was 96, time of Domitian. I just don't hold to that. Okay? But, anyway. But what we say, he was born 37. So he was born 7 years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. How much of a role did that play in his understanding? You know, growing up in Jerusalem and Rome, probably grew up in a place where it was like, okay. And spending time with Essenes, and then coming back as a Pharisee, they were persecuting Christians in Jerusalem and Judea very heavily in those first few years. That's going to end the intertestamental period of history. But that's a good lead-in to the book of Revelation, rather than going to, like, the life of Christ, because you probably already studied most of that anyway. We have a clear understanding of that. Pardon?
Once again, it has shown if you want things to get messed up, just turn it over to man.
Yes. God takes us so far. At this point, God takes us so far. God does what God needs to do. And then God says, now it's up to you. And at that point, how are you going to react? Are the deists correct? I don't believe so. The deists would say, well, see, God comes in and does this, and then he just goes away, and he doesn't interfere. No, I think God was in it all the way through. He just wasn't there with prophets all the way through, but he's letting man, hate to use the word evolve, but allowing his chosen people at the time to develop based on what he's given them.
I was going to say, he's given us, us, all of the tools we need. We just failed to use them for his edification.
Right, and now we've got the new covenant. He's given that. He's taken care of Rome. He's taken care, is God still active? I believe God's still active in ways providentially, but he's expecting us to follow his way. And wow, the world today, has the world ever been worse? Sure. Time to know, there's only 8. And we're not sure about 7 of them. No, it might have been the only good one. So, we are. Anyway, thank you for your time. Again, these are all going to be on YouTube. Most of them are. This will be put on and for future edification. Thank you.